Hemen bir sandalye ayarlayabilir miyiz? Teşekkürler.
Koltuk tercihtir. Bayan gelecek, mümkünse bir koltuk olursa iyi olur. Yes, it's coming. It's coming. Yes, please. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participating in this international conference on apartheid in Palestine land. Unfortunately, the problem is continue about the apartheid which was practiced in South Africa. Unfortunately, it's practiced in Palestine by Israel against the native people. I believe that this apartheid one day would be end, but we have to be aware of all these discriminations. Thank you very much for your participating again. أعزائي الكرام، شكرا لكم ولمتابعتكم إلى هذا المؤتمر الدولي. إن هذا الفصل العنصرية لا يزال.
What he said in English. Dear guests, thank you for your attendance. Apartheid is still continuous. It was applied against the native Indians by the white men against the original inhabitants of South Africa, and we hope that it will not continue. However, we hope hopefully one day that it will not continue forever. Thank you very much for participating in this international conference, and now I would like to give the floor to the speakers of this conference. For each speaker, we have 20 minutes, no more than that. I'm a very punctual man.
Continue after 20 minutes. No much more than 20 minutes. Thank you very much again. Yes, I would like to start with Maria. Yeah.
Can we speak from the podium?
Yes.
Thank you to Dr. Rima Khalaf and the other organizers of this conference. Is that better?
Yes, you can start.
Is that better? Great. Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Rima Khalaf and the other organisers of this conference for providing me with this opportunity to speak today. In Ireland, we recently commemorated an action carried out 35 years ago by a group of ordinary people known as the Dunn's Stores Strikers. These 9 supermarket workers one day decided that they would no longer handle South African produce. They would not physically handle the fruits of apartheid. And they subsequently embarked on a strike which galvanized civil society, which ultimately resulted in the Irish government imposing a ban on the import of South African produce. It was the first ban by a Western country, making a strong statement that we will not import goods from apartheid South Africa. Change led by civil society is possible. My input today is on the role of civil society organisations and youth movements in combating the Israeli apartheid regime. Because of the multiplicity of tactics and strategies that have been and are being employed by Palestinian organisations, generic civil society organisations and youth movements across the globe, I will focus on a framework that we as a civil society organisation applied to introducing groundbreaking legislation in Ireland, the learning from which can be transferred into effective mobilisation against Israeli apartheid. 10 years ago, SADACA, the Ireland-Palestine Alliance, was formed to mobilise support in Ireland for the freedom and rights of the Palestinian people. Since 2009, we have worked towards securing a ban on the importation of goods from illegal settlements. And having considered and exhausted other options, we began on the current inception of the Occupied Territories Bill in 2016. The starting point on the development of this bill was to address the only vulnerability of Israel. Israel is strategic, it's focused, it has an extraordinary publicity machine and widespread influence in most countries. It has powerful allies and apparently limitless resources. So what is its vulnerability? It breaks the law. Israel is in flagrant breach of international law on a daily and persistent basis. However, we also know that international law is limited in and of itself. There are no effective courts, no punitive measures. It is effectively a blunt instrument. But it is an instrument that we have at our disposal nonetheless, and applies a standard to which nation states are politically obliged, if not legally mandated, to adhere to. In the case of the Occupied Territories Bill, it provided us with the framework within which we could draft domestic legislation, a tangible legislative sanction around which we could craft a targeted political campaign. The Occupied Territories Bill, if and when enacted, will ban the import of goods from illegal Israeli settlements into Ireland. It has already passed the Upper House of Parliament and has made global history by doing so. It has already passed the first crucial stage in the Lower House of Parliament. If enacted, we believe this bill will send a strong message to the State of Israel that it can no longer breach international law with impunity. The methodology we used provides a useful template from which we can design strategies to also address Israeli apartheid. In initiating our legislation, our campaign strategy was both based on 4 key components: the involvement of legal personnel who drafted robust legislation firmly based in international law, clarity and simplicity of message. Settlements are a war crime. In trading with those settlements, we are complicit in war crimes. The message is simple and it's very difficult to object to. 3, location of the campaign at the heart of mainstream civil society and its mobilisation to influence political leaders. And 4, creation of a coalition of allies through engagement with a range of key players and stakeholders, both domestically and internationally. For the purposes of today, I will talk us through that 4th component, the creation of a global coalition of allies, this team, which has been central to the success of the campaign. The careful and strategic identification of allies is crucial in all campaign designs. Our coalition of global and domestic allies began with SADACA, grew into a small core team in Ireland and has evolved into a global web of experts and stakeholders, each of whom are playing and continue to play a critical and distinctive role. So I'll take us through those in turn. Number one, mainstream NGOs in Ireland. Mainstream and highly respected NGOs and trade unions who work to a broader agenda of social justice, inequality and international development formed the core strategy team for this legislation. Their involvement has been crucial in locating the issue of advocacy for Palestine away from dedicated pro-Palestinian organisations like ourselves and into the heart of mainstream society. Those of us who lead civil society organisations exclusively dedicated to the achievement of Palestinian rights have a responsibility to ensure that the issue of Palestine lies at the heart of mainstream society, to ensure that the Palestinian cause is not perceived as a marginal issue, is not seen as an issue of the left, is not owned by any one particular sector, but located at the heart of central society. For us, that sometimes includes tactically stepping back to enable mainstream NGOs to be the public face of the campaign. 2. Members of the Legislature and Parliament. Civil society organisations are by definition limited in what we can achieve. Regardless of the merits of our case or the strengths of our convictions, without political allies who will affect policy or legislative change, there will be little or no tangible political outcome to our work. Our role is to ensure that our elected representatives are informed on the issues, that they're well briefed with succinct evidence, that they're thanked and supported when they act constructively, and that they're challenged respectfully when they do not. Many years of advocacy work by Sadaka and other organisations in Ireland has helped create the political environment in which progression of this legislation was possible. As a consequence, its introduction was not viewed as a radical move, but a logical progression from previous advocacy work which had generated multiple parliamentary debates and government policy statements on the issue of Israeli settlements. Identification of the most appropriate and effective political allies to lead on taking this legislation through the Parliament has been crucial. The political representatives we approached to lead out on taking this legislation needed to command respect on a cross-party basis, across the full political spectrum. They needed to be perceived as non-threatening and non-partisan, to be highly committed to the political objective, and crucially, they needed to have the personal and political strength to withstand intense US and Israeli pressure. And we have no doubt, but without the dedication and the commitment of the independent senator and political party we approached to take forward this legislation through the Houses of Parliament, it would remain as an abstract idea with great potential. The general public. Key to progress in the campaign has been and continues to be the ordinary citizens of Ireland galvanising support for the cause of Palestine in every domain of Irish life. This is one of the core strengths of civil society organisations. Targeted campaigns with tangible outcomes provide platforms for the engagement of individual citizens angered by the actions of the Israeli state and the inaction of our own governments. We mobilised people through social media, micro-marketing, events and established databases of supports. The types of action we requested were relatively small, but collectively were powerful. For instance, in the last couple of weeks, we have gathered 6,500 signatures from across the country that are arriving in the postbox of one politician. So one small action, but collectively powerful influence. Human rights witnesses. While the context of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute and other implements of international law have provided us with the framework for the legislation, it is not breaches of those in themselves which mobilise civil society into action. Ireland, like many other countries, has a strong and vibrant network of human rights witnesses who have spent time in the West Bank. These are not people who talk the language of international law when they're mobilising civil society into action. They are people who have multiple stories of families being evicted from their homes, of homes being demolished, of Palestinian families living with the everyday threat of potentially lethal violence from settlers. They tell the human story of settlements. They basically recount the devastating human cost of Israel's brutal settlement plan, and that is what mobilises civil society. Palestinian civil society organisations. Our civil society partner organisations in Palestine have been key allies and must be core to any strategy to dismantling apartheid. They not only add moral authority to our objective through their endorsement and reassurance that Palestinian civil society is fully behind the legislation, they provide substantial practical assistance in creating direct access to Palestinian society. They have been the conduit from Irish civil society to Palestinian civil society, and that link is absolutely crucial. Palestinian political leaders, leaders of all segments of Palestinian society have played a role. Those in Palestine have travelled to Ireland to meet our political leaders. That includes people like Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who's here with us, who at one point travelled twice within 6 weeks just because we needed him. It includes people like Archbishop Atalahanna, who've attended gruelling speaking tours in Ireland for numerous years to meet with our political leaders. I cannot overstate the importance of political leaders coming directly from Palestine and negotiating with our political leaders. There is no replacement for the power of that Palestinian voice. The mission in Ireland is a constant and essential ally, and Palestinian leaders in the Knesset, such as Haneen Zouabi here, have advocated also in support of the legislation. Suffice it to say, as our Parliament did not expect to receive a letter on Knesset-headed paper on the morning of the first vote, and our thanks to you for that. International leaders of influence. Insights and analysis from key political players in the international arena has served as crucial interventions. They provide context, perspective, insights into international thinking, and reassurance that action by an individual state is not only the right thing to do, it is the only thing to do to change the current trajectory. And that includes people like Dr. Rima Khalaf, who was with us on the day we announced the legislation and who has been a supportive ally to us in the intervening couple of years. Supportive Israelis. Israelis who are advocates for justice for Palestine have an important role to play, as did white South Africans, in dismantling apartheid in South Africa. They are the unexpected voices, the voices that jolt the politically unaware to reflect on what must be so wrong as to engage and mobilise people whom we would naturally expect to align themselves with Israel. In the case of our bill, intervention of Israeli supporters have been game changers. Celebrity endorsement. Part of the challenge for civil society organisations is to mobilise a population into awareness and action. It's easy to preach to the converted. It's much more challenging to convince those who are politically disinterested or disaffected. One of the ways in which we can achieve this is through endorsement from sources outside the political arena, a celebrity culture, a young generation inextricably linked to social media, and media platforms with their focus on short, succinct, and primarily visual messaging present us with new challenges in political advocacy. A team of legal experts, a working group comprising experts from around the EU, is engaged in a highly rigorous process of reviewing the bill in absolute minutiae to ensure that it will not only withstand the scrutiny of the Irish legislature, but will withstand the legal challenge which will inevitably emerge at an EU level. Their role is vital, not only ensuring we get the bill through in Ireland, but to ensure its transferability to other states. Finally, there are those who have provided us with financial assistance at key points in time. Most of our work as civil society organisations is as volunteers, and that can be challenging given the formidable task. Those who have invested in us, and there's one of you in the room today, have played a hugely significant role in getting the legislation to this point, and we're very grateful for that. So to conclude, as civil society organisations, our role is to harness and channel the strength of feeling of ordinary citizens regarding Israel's colonial apartheid regime, to hold our governments to account for their responsibilities under international law, and to marry those two dimensions. SEDACA drafted the current inception of the Occupied Territories Bill in 2016. In taking it forward, we knew we were taking a risk, because a defeat at any point in time in the legislative process is effectively a victory for Israel, or certainly will be packaged as such. Yes. But we are at a point where actions, sometimes with calculated risks, need to be taken. As everybody in this room knows, and some of you painfully know, words of condemnation have not changed a single fact of life for Palestinians. SEDACA's learning in taking the bill forward is fully consistent with the aim of this conference in creating a global coalition. No one organisation or sector can possibly be successful if acting alone. Our efficacy will lie in our ability to both assume leadership, but also to create strong and effective coalitions of well-chosen partners. In conclusion, whether it's at the level of the supermarket workers I described at the outset, or the coordinated strategy that I've partially just described, not only do civil society organisations have a role to play in dismantling Israeli apartheid, we have an absolute responsibility to assume a determined and proactive role in attempting to end what has to be the greatest political injustice of our time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now, who is it? Ali Abunimah. Apartheid, occupation and settler colonialism, Palestine struggles for liberation and attaining justice. Yes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me first thank our gracious hosts here in Turkey and all the organizers of this conference, especially Dr. Rima Khalaf, whose persistence and vision was so instrumental in bringing us all here today. To defeat and dismantle Israeli apartheid, we must first understand its strengths and its weaknesses. We can then ensure that our own strategies as activists, organizations, and political formations maximize our advantages and exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities. Many of Israel's strengths are obvious. Israel has an enormous military power and resources that allow it to maintain internal physical control over historic Palestine and fend off almost any external enemy. While Palestinian and Lebanese military resistance groups do not have the ability and do not seek generally to go on the offensive against the Israeli regime, their strategy is defensive. In Gaza, the resistance seeks to make Israeli aggression too costly for Israeli leaders to contemplate. I don't want to underplay the role of legitimate military resistance. It has denied and will continue to deny Israel the total victory it seeks over Palestinians. That is not insignificant. But there is no major group that is pursuing a strategy of ending Israeli apartheid principally through force of arms. Israel, of course, has a large economy that is well integrated into international capitalism. Israel's GDP is around $370 billion, about 50% larger than Egypt, which has more than 10 times Israel's population, and about 9 times the size of Jordan, which has a roughly similar population. Israel has built up a large amount of cultural and political capital, especially in the West, where elites have absorbed the Zionist propaganda claim that support for Israel is just and moral compensation for the European Christian genocide of European Jews. Related to this, Israel possesses an extensive and powerful international lobby made up of openly pro-Israel groups as well as Jewish communal organizations and non-Jewish ones, especially Christian Zionist groups. This lobby not only seeks to advance Israel's case in every possible forum, but also to enforce adherence to Israel's narrative by making it costly for political leaders, institutions, and individuals to deviate from Israel's narrative. Each of these claims I'm making could be debated, but given the shortness of time, I'm simply going to take them as given. But when confronted with these realities, a common response is defeatism. I often hear that Israel and its lobby are too strong, so we must give up on the struggle or find some accommodation. Along with selfish self-interest, this defeatist logic certainly underlies the ongoing wave of normalization between Arab states and elites on the one hand and Zionism on the other. And yet, when we look at Israel's strengths, we can also see in them Israel's weaknesses. While Israel retains enormous military power, this can no longer produce the desired political results as in the past. Israel was unable to impose its political will on Lebanon through its 1982 invasion and subsequent two-decade-long occupation and its repeated attacks on that country. And over the last decade, successive Israeli attacks on Gaza have not succeeded in imposing a collaborationist leadership there, such as exists in occupied Ramallah. At best, from Israel's perspective, habitual slaughter of civilians in the besieged and blockaded Gaza Strip, mowing the lawn, as Israeli leaders like to call it, buys a few months or years of what Israel calls calm for its citizens. But each Israeli attack exacts a price to Israel's legitimacy around the world. As activists and political groupings, there is little we can do with respect to the military balance, though of course we must continue to push for an arms embargo on Israel. Yet it is precisely in the field of Israel's struggle for legitimacy where Israel is weakest and we possess the most influence. More than 71 years after the Nakba, the catastrophe of Israel's violent imposition over the ruins of Palestine, Israel is still fighting to prove its legitimacy, its so-called right to exist in Zionist parlance. Not only has Israel failed to secure universal acceptance of this alleged right, but it is a further loss of legitimacy that Israeli leaders fear most and are currently fighting to prevent. Here, for example, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa is instructive. Despite notable differences, apartheid South Africa remains the closest recent parallel to the situation in historic Palestine, of a settler colonial community ruling over an indigenous people by force. Apartheid South Africa, as of course you will all recall, ended formally in 1994. During apartheid, there were huge uprisings. I remember during the late 1980s seeing on TV the images of the uprisings in the townships and seeing the images from the first Intifada in Palestine, and they looked identical. There were mass mobilizations, including strikes and protests, and the response of the apartheid state was enormous violence and massacres of black South Africans resisting the racist regime. The regime also faced some internal military resistance and sabotage, but most of the military challenge it faced was in Angola, where the Cuban military, support for the resistance played a crucial role in defeating the Israeli armed South African military. However, despite the increasing cost to the South African regime, the resistance did not substantially succeed in changing the balance of physical coercive force in South Africa. The white supremacist regime retained until the end its near monopoly on military and physical force. The balance did not change. The anti-apartheid movement did not defeat did not defeat South Africa militarily. What happened is that the apartheid regime, which had enjoyed considerable support among Europeans and Americans up until at least the 1950s, saw its legitimacy drain away. Up to that point, in Britain and in other parts of Europe, there was enormous sympathy for what was called the predicament of whites in Africa in the context of decolonization. Once this legitimacy was gone, whites and their collaborators in South Africa lost the will to maintain a system that relied solely on repression and violence and rendered them international pariahs. So they negotiated a way out. It all happened much more quickly and with considerably less violence than even the most optimistic predictions of the time. This outcome, moreover, could not have been predicted based on what whites said they were willing to accept. Until near the end of apartheid, opinion polls showed that whites overwhelmingly opposed a one-person, one-vote system, just as today the vast majority of Israeli Jews oppose democracy in historic Palestine. As our South African comrades remind us often, international solidarity played a critical role. Enough people in Europe and America were no longer willing to defend a white supremacist regime and forced their governments and corporations to begin to end their complicity with apartheid. There were also geopolitical factors at play. With the end of the Cold War, the South African regime was no longer so useful as an anti-communist tool, and its European and American allies could more easily dispense with it. But once the loss of legitimacy was advanced and irreversible, and opposing South African apartheid became the central global moral cause of its day, the apartheid leadership was willing to negotiate the end of political apartheid, though, as many critics have pointed out, whites retained control of the economy. This is a situation that Israeli leaders are desperate to avoid. Yet they recognize that loss of legitimacy, not military defeat, is Israel's greatest vulnerability. This was articulated in 2010 in a report from the Re'ut Institute, a think tank close to the Israeli government. Re'ut concluded that Israel's traditional strategic doctrine, which views threats to the state's existence primarily in military terms to be met with a military response, was badly out of date. Rather, it claimed that Israel faced a combined threat from a so-called resistance network and a delegitimization network.
The last 2 minutes.
The resistance network is comprised of political and armed groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, which use asymmetrical warfare to challenge Israel. The resistance network allegedly aims to cause Israel's political implosion, according to the Re'ut Institute, just like South Africa, East Germany, or the Soviet Union, rather than bring about military defeat through direct confrontation on the battlefield. This delegitimization network, according to Re'ut, is made up of the broad international movement for peace and justice, including the BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, and activists, trade unions, churches, and so on all over the world. In particular, Re'ut saw the sharpest loss of legitimacy taking place among the global political left and progressive forces. No single analysis has had a bigger influence on Israel and its lobby, and they adopted the Reut report as their blueprint. Over the last decade, Israel and its lobby have been spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to shore up Israel's legitimacy and to delegitimize the delegitimizers, in Israel's language. Israel aims to build support through a massive Brand Israel marketing campaign. It hopes to co-opt political and cultural influencers by bringing everyone from food bloggers to police chiefs to community activists on free propaganda trips to Israel. This campaign has been particularly targeted at the Western political left, based on the understanding that public support in Western liberal democracies is critical to maintaining those countries' long-term support for Israel. The Israeli propaganda campaign tries to portray Israel as feminist, supportive of gay rights, and a protector of the environment, strategies called pinkwashing and greenwashing that are often built on racist defamation against Arabs and Muslims mixed in with lies. Yet the propaganda is belied by the reality of Israel's horrific violence against Palestinians, its racism against migrants and refugees from African states, and its open alliances with the global far right, including the Trump administration, the Hindu nationalist Modi government in India, and anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim ultra-nationalist parties and governments in Europe, such as Germany's Alternative for Deutschland and Hungary's anti-Jewish Prime Minister Viktor Orban. In the meantime, the Palestine Solidarity Movement has made considerable advances, a fact acknowledged by the Reut Institute itself. In 2017, a leaked analysis from the Reut Institute and the Anti-Defamation League outlined Israel's failure to stem the impressive growth and significant successes, their words, of the BDS movement. The report revealed that pro-Israel groups had increased their spending to combat the Palestine Solidarity Movement 20-fold over the previous 6 years, a 20 times increase in spending. Yet despite these tens of millions of dollars, according to the report's own words, results remain elusive. The loss of support for Israel is evident even in the United States. Confirming long-term trends, a recent survey conducted by the University of Maryland found that 70% of respondents oppose laws that target BDS activism as an infringement on the right to free speech. Among the more than 3,000 Americans surveyed, about half had heard of the BDS movement, a remarkably high proportion. And of those who had heard of the BDS movement, 26% supported the boycott of Israel, and another 26% neither supported nor opposed it. Fewer than half said they opposed BDS. But here's a significant difference.
Exceeded 2 minutes.
I have 4 minutes.
No.
4 minutes.
No.
But I won't use them. I won't use them.
No. My watch is valuable.
About half of Democratic Party voters in the United States said they supported BDS, and nearly 80% of the Democrats who had heard of the movement agreed that BDS is a legitimate, peaceful way of opposing Israeli occupation. Similar trends are visible in Europe and elsewhere. These trends are cause for celebration, but not for complacency. As support for Palestinian rights rises, Israel and its allies are resorting to ever greater repression, especially laws and policies that attempt to define BDS and support for Palestinian rights as anti-Semitism. Simply fending off Israel's attacks absorbs an enormous amount of activist energy and may deter new people from joining our movement. Yet the overall picture is clear. Israel is losing legitimacy. It is nearing its South Africa moment. But that moment will remain far off, and Palestinians will face appalling suffering for years to come if we do not escalate our efforts based on a deliberate and clear-eyed analysis of where we are strong and Israel is weak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now dismantling the Israeli apartheid regime as a precondition for justice, equality, and peace for all. Hanin Zwaibi, former Arab member of Israeli Knesset. Thank you.
مساء الخير. بدي أعمل زي علي، أنا بدي كمان أحط الوقت. ريما، شكراً للدعوة وللمؤتمر.
As well as for this important conference. And a special thank to Richard and Jennifer, the researchers who submitted a paper or a report that made me feel ashamed when I read it. Not because it was surprising, but because it has a narrative that we as people should have, and as political parties and political forces. Although I belong to a party that was mentioned in the report, it has no one of the speakers mentioned it, but Richard and Jennifer mentioned it. It is a party that has the project of combating and dismantling the apartheid and the Israeli regime. It is the Tajammu' party, and it is a kind of the unity, or a party that brings Palestinians together. From my position as a politician, and it's not a coincidence that from 25 speakers, only 2 politicians are speaking. From among a people that is struggling, whose politicians should carry the same ideology or struggle. It's not a coincidence that the politicians are not present, and the marginal presence of a politician. I myself, I don't believe that civil society organization can be the carrier or the conduit of the struggle of these people, or that they can bring the world or the international community to support us. The international support of the international community comes when we have our own vision, our own project. Solidarity needs to have a clear vision. People need to know, what do you want? When we meet with diplomats, for example, we support or we advocate for BDS, but the authority, they tell us, well, the Palestinian Authority doesn't want the BDS to be there. So how can we bring the world to have solidarity with us if we don't know what we want? This report that I talked about reveals what is absent from it. And the question that we cannot avoid, and which the conference did not mention, where is the political project or vision that translates this narrative? Where is the political leadership that regulates and organizes the struggle of these people and put it under the umbrella from that report? The report analyzes Israel. The apartheid project will not or combating the apartheid will not liberate us. It just analyze and interpret what we see. We understand that the difference between Israel and a project that we have is stemming from this consciousness in order to eliminate the the apartheid system or the apartheid regime. And this question is not about understanding that, it's about the political will. Our problem is not that we don't understand. I don't think that as parties inside Palestine that we don't understand Israel. No. We are sitting there and we understand that, but sometimes we are unable to answer the question, to hold a project that answers the question of how to deal with Israel that is up to the level of the challenge that we have in front of Israel as an apartheid system. So this narrative, it doesn't only reveal Israel, but it shows also the impotence of our political vision and our political failure, which is the main conduit. People who attend the conference, you will imagine that we will be liberated if we go to the international courts and if we resort to the international resolutions. And I said before, and I repeat, I don't believe in that. And we will not be liberated through recommendations, because if a conference comes up with the recommendation that the Palestinian, I think this conference needs to come with one recommendation that the Palestinian people must organize themselves. Do we want to come up with a vision? Do we want a state, or do we want people? Do we want separate cantons to represent us? Or, for example, some people say, as you heard, that people inside are different from people, Palestinian people outside, and people who are inside know better how to deal with Israel. So we need, our narrative need to deal with Israel as a project in the first place, not as an apartheid project, because there is some narrative that says Israel is about parties that some of them belong to the right, some of them belong to the left, and let's see when maybe we can deal with the liberals of the Israelis, and they don't want to see Israel as one project. This narrative, or this conference, sees Israel as a project. You need to deal with it as that. Now, whether it is a settlement or an apartheid or anything, it is a project. It is a project. Before we get into the details, who is better than the other, Gantz or Netanyahu, or gets in between the orange and the peel, we need to see that as a project, and it must be countered with a counter project. This is not a recommendation. This is the first responsibility of the victim. We as victims, where is our project? And do we have a project? And do we agree? We, the parties inside Palestine, forget the Palestinian Authority, the political forces, do they agree that we have an umbrella that brings us together when we talk about the Palestinian people? Or we inside Syria, we need to talk about equality, and those in the West Bank talk about occupation? So dealing with Israel as a project is very important to bring, to give the definition or the entity of the Palestinian people, and to give them one identity. In Jerusalem, Palestinians tell us that Israel is dealing with us as people. So let's deal with Israel as its people. So Israel is our enemy, but this is the common ground between those in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jerusalem. Let's see it as this common ground that we need to see. So we are, Israel understands us, and it deals with us as one people. It uses citizenship as a strategy for control that I will speak about with the time that I have, and it uses the Judaizing Jerusalem as a tool of occupation. So this narrative, which says that we need to start since the beginning, that we need to reanalyze or revisit our analysis of Israel, and we need to revisit creating or the creation of one unifying Palestinian project. This narrative is not against the Israeli apartheid regime. It is against the Palestinian political system. This narrative brings us back as one people and brings back our moral responsibility, and it brings back the energy or the influence that political powers can do. The most important thing now is the deal of the century. Now Israel is eliminating one file after the other. Now there is no talk about the refugees. Now the Jewidization of Jerusalem and the shift, transporting the American embassy and other embassies into Jerusalem. So Israel is closing one file after another. We need to be strong on the ground and to impose ourselves there. We are strong with the question of legitimacy. We can say Israel can do whatever it wants, but it has no legitimacy there. I want to go back to open files since 1948 and even before that. The question of legitimacy is not only a moral question. It's a question that says that you can annex territories, you can open embassies in Jerusalem, but I will go back to square one. I will ask about the legitimacy question. Even if when you go beyond Oslo, I will go beyond Oslo as well, back in time until the original, the core story before 1948. When some people have an obsession with the Gans recommendation. I don't understand that. And some people have, and of course we have a problem which is Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority says we are, or sorry, the Palestinian people says we are with the authority. Whatever, if the authority wants Oslo, okay, we agree with that. Where is the Palestinian people that is struggling? You are the ones responsible, not the authority. You need to put a pressure whether you want to for Palestinians to serve in the Israeli army or not, to follow Oslo Accords or not, etc., etc. The Israel that claims that it doesn't understand, it actually understands, but it wants to create its... sorry, the Palestinian Authority understands well what they have, but they want to create their own project according to the political will that they have and the political power that they have. But unfortunately, we don't have the political will to counter the Israeli project. The importance of this narrative brings us to expand the political activity. We can learn from South Africa. What we learn from South Africa, only the word apartheid, but we don't get into the civil struggle in South Africa. Not only the mere word of apartheid. What people in South Africa did was completely different from what we are doing. The problems of this narrative now. Or let's say the timing of this narrative. This narrative, whether it is a colonial word or the Israeli apartheid, it's not a problem, but maybe because Jennifer and Richard used that word because it is in breach of the international community. It is the worst political time that is disengaged from the expectations of people. I mean, our reality is in a place, and this narrative is in a completely different place. This is the first timing. The second timing, it came in a time that Israel is telling you, relax. Israel is very self-confident to enact a law of apartheid, to say that I am a state of apartheid, and in the first and the second provisions, it's not saying the state of Israel, it's saying the land of Israel. The Israeli laws talk about a state, normal laws talk about the state. The first and the second provisions that establish the law, they are not talking about a state. They are talking about the land of Israel. For the first time, this is a basic law, and it was passed. The law that says that you can't, it's not that you may be racist, it is your duty to be a racist. It is the responsibility of the state to discriminate in favor of the Jews. It is a duty. And if before that law, if they couldn't give you a house or prevent you from getting into a building, you could go, for example, to the court. After this law, you will not be able to do so. Of course, the courts will not pay you justice in terms of issues related to property or land rights. But we were playing on the margin of the Israeli democracy that was not designed for Palestinians. It was designed for Israelis or for those Jews. But inside Palestine, we are playing on that margin in order to widen the crack or the discrepancy between the Jewish nature of the state and the citizenship. So now you can't go to the court to have any racism claim, because now you have this law. The court will tell you, we have the law of the apartheid. I have 5 minutes. She said I have 15 minutes, but then she realized she had only 5 minutes. So let's our duty is to translate this law to all languages, to have this law in front of any ambassador or any parliament member. It's to embarrass Israel. Now, citizenship. After this pessimistic introduction, and the last 5 minutes will be a little bit optimistic. Why? Because we will not be strugglers or having a cause if we don't read our struggle from the analysis of the reality. We have something nice, which is the will. We have something that is the pessimism of the mind and the optimism of the will. We can see what Gaza is doing, that has been under 10 years of siege in an inhumane circumstances, and they are creative in their struggles, sometimes with balloons and sometimes with snipers and killing Israelis, but the people are struggling there. But I will talk about the experience of citizenship. Let's see what this narrative is telling me. It is telling me that I am in conflict with Israel. Citizenship is something that is anti-conflict. When we talk about citizenship, it is a non-conflicting aspect. It is an arrangement between citizens and the states. Look what we have to do inside Syria. We are not traitors and we are not heroes. We started to get into the Israeli politics, starting from the point that Zionism is a moral problem. The only party that was allowed to work is the Communist Party, because it dealt with Zionism as a legitimate moral problem, and it was allowed to get into the Knesset because it accepted the partition resolution, and the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, rejected the partition resolution. That's the problem, the point of the division. So it's not that we inside Palestine, we don't see the conflict. No. Just as the point of the establishment, how humiliating it was. But we want to be part of this state. When I say that we are not all the 150,000, but I say the political narrative, the Knesset. How did we get into that? How did we create the issue of citizenship? From the Knesset. In 49, two people talked about citizenship. Ben Gurion, I don't know, maybe Hayim Weizmann, I don't know, either that or that. And the second one was Amin Jarjoura, the Arab Knesset member who spoke about working or inaugurating the first session in the Knesset. And we were discussing the state that we want to be part of this state. Now, I'm talking about the struggle that is 70 years old. I'm coming to the happy end, so don't worry. We said that we want to be with the army, and we are with the partition decision. So just to be brief, we were under military rule, and that we are not part of the people. We were in that ghetto. We are facing Israel after the defeat. We didn't understand what happened. The weakest 15%, we are the farmers and the sons of farmers who can work in agriculture and in herding the sheep. And the land was confiscated and the sheep were confiscated, and even in the state, the place we were living, we didn't have even milk. So the Israelis are the ones who give us milk and yogurt. Until the day of the land, when we started to use the term rights in a very ugly use of history, we thank Israel that it didn't accept us. Sometimes it is good that Israel is righteous, that it doesn't accept us and they slap us sometimes in order to wake up. Now, we have been fighting the survival fight for 20 years. Then we started to talk about rights. Israel removed the military rule, and it opens a little bit for some democracy. And then I moved to the democratic gathering, Palestinian gathering, that I'm honored to be part of it. It is the only party that is in the Knesset, and I'm not doing a propaganda for electoral program here. But this is the only party that says we cannot reach equality under a Jewish state. There is a discrepancy between the democratic state and the Jewish state, and we need to dismantle that. We need to change the regime. Before this perfect report and before Durban in 2001 in South Africa, there was a party in the Knesset, and we have cameras here. I will use the democratic dictionary. The state cannot be Jewish and democratic, so the regime must be inclusive of all citizens. So the loyalty must be, I will not be loyal to this occupying force, but this government must be loyal to the state. So Israel must answer this question, is it democratic or not? This narrative is being defined in the court as that it undermines the state, and the Israeli intelligence define it as a strategic threat. In 2008, Yuval Kisk, the head of the Shabak, says that the Iranian nuclear, Hezbollah is a strategic threat, and all those who don't recognize Israel as a democratic and a Jewish state is a strategic threat, and Israel knows what it says. So when we undermine the legitimacy question of Israel from a democratic point of view, the head of the Shabak said that this is an illegal thing, even if all the democratic means are used. So that means, finally, we need this narrative because after Oslo and Israel overlooked Oslo, and we don't know that we can't have a state in the 22% that remains from Palestine. We can't talk about that only as a vision. We need to create our own political vision. What is the one state that we want to have? And from the perspective of the owner of the land and the master, We need to answer a very hard question that was asked yesterday, that she said, I'm not concerned about what we do with the Jews or the Israelis. I'm defending my people. But you are an owner of the land. You have 6 million people who are outside, who are in your land. What are you going to do with that? If they are guests in your home, you need to know what to do with them. So this brings back the moral compass for us. Once again, the recommendation for Gantz is a turning point, because if I am I need to know what to do inside Israel as someone who is living inside Israel. So this means that my compass is the cause of my people, and I have to define the interest of the 1.5 million Palestinians. And I'm confronting mainly the Israeli project. The only solution is to go back to square one. The Zionist project is illegitimate.
Thank you for you, and thanks for your lecture.
شكرا لك ولمحاضرتك المشجعة.
Thank you very much and for your encouraging lecture. God bless you. I hope that the right will be returned one day. Thank you.
Liberation Organization in dismantling the Israeli apartheid regime. Hani Al-Masri, Director General of Masarat, the Palestinian Center for Policy Research and Strategic Studies.
مساء الخير.
شكرا.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing parties of this important conference, especially for Dr. Mr. Khalaf, because conducting such conferences in such circumstances is considered a courage, because today those who demand boycott are persecuted legally in many of the countries over the world. Therefore, I commend your courage, and I encourage you to continue exercising efforts in this regard. For a human being to speak after lunch and after Haneen, it is very difficult task to do. I'll try to tackle some issues that are related to my role, the role of the Liberation Organization in the dismantling of the apartheid. We have to remember that the Liberation Organization passed through two main stages. The first one from the establishment and until the Oslo Accords, and the second one as at the signature of the Oslo Accords and up to now. I am saying that the Liberation Organization went through two stages. The first one as at the establishment and until the Oslo, from establishment to Oslo Accords, and second one from Oslo Accords to present. This is why we should not mainstream it the role in two stages. There is a difference between the role in both of them. At the beginning, or the first stage, we consider it the Palestinian Renaissance, turning it from a cause of refugees into a political cause, into a political one, into a liberation, a national liberation movement, into a cause for people exercising the rights, including the right to self-destination. In this stage, the organization was able, after the entry of the factions, particularly the Fatah movement, to create a national body for the Palestinians, to unify the Palestinians, and title for that was Liberation and Return, and the methodology that was adopted was armed strife. That was in some time the only way and sometimes the main way. There are many points that may be criticized with regard to this stage, but if we look into this stage and to compare it with the next stage, then we would be remembering it with respect, because there are many differences that took place to the role, nature and structure and representation of the PLO at the first stage, and during that stage the PLO was able to reach into a resolution by the UN to consider the Zionist movement a racial movement. This resolution was passed in 1975, and the text of that resolution condemns the Zionist ideology and demands the world to resist that. Before Oslo Accords and before the Madrid Peace Conference, they reversed that decision, because Israel was contingent not to attend the Madrid conference, and it would attend only if they reversed that decision. And in 1991, they passed another resolution to reverse the past revolution, considering Israel as a form of racial practice. And as we say in Arabic, you know the content by reading the title. And if the resolution says that it is a racial movement, it is natural to expect that we will reach to what we have reached to. It was not an appropriate start. We should have built on that decision. We should have dealt with it in a different way. In this stage, Hamas and Islamic Jihad movements came to the forefront, and the PLO witnessed that rise as a main challenge. It tried to accommodate Hamas in particular within the structure of the PLO, but Hamas was proving that it can work from outside and that it may provide an alternative for the PLO until they changed their position in March in 2005, and the two movements decided to be part of the PLO. My words to what I'm speaking about, Hamas, is documented with the highest senior levels of the Hamas leadership. They told me that we were thinking that we will have the ability to form an alternative liberation movement, but we discovered that there is an international and a pan-Arab decision made that only the PLO is allowed. This is why the late Yasser Arafat allowed them. They had disagreements about the conditions to enter at the same time, but in fact Hamas was not really concerned about that entry, and we know the literature that they used to publish in the statements and documents of Hamas with regard to the PLO. The second stage is very important because it is very risky. I would say that in the Oslo Accords signature, the PLO committed political suicide. It was not a tactic, it was not a mistake, it was a political suicide, as at that time PLO is in the CPR unit, and they bring it back to life when they need it. When Fatah movement fell down in the elections, they called back PLO for some time. It didn't play the role it used to play in the past, but they want to say that we are able to compete with Hamas by our presence in the PLO, but they were not keen to activate the role of the Liberation Organization. I personally had discussions with President Abbas, and I told him, okay, guys, activate it without Hamas. There are many ways you can activate it, and you can do it without Hamas. They kept it to sign the final agreement that was expected in May in 1999 in the Oslo Agreement. Therefore, the Liberation Organization is useful only when it comes to signing on behalf of the Palestinian people. And when they reached into May 1999, we have not witnessed any change of position, any real change in the Palestinian strategy, the adopted one. It is risky. It's not the mistake. It is rather that your politics would reach into utter failure because of this strategy, and that you would reproduce and remake the same mistakes, and this would affect the Palestinian territory people and cause, and it affects a lot in what we reach to now. This is very important. Another point of importance I have to indicate too is that PLO tried to claim that it carries or it plays two roles at the same time by being part of the boycott movement, but that adoption was not ever a real adoption. The PLO is still part of the boycott, but they have not exerted any efforts. But many of the time they create impediments and obstacles. And there is a claim that was expressed by President Abu Mazen Abbas when he visited South Africa in 2013, when he was visiting that country during the funeral of Nelson Mandela. He said that we do not boycott Israel, but we recognize the legitimacy of Israel. We have relationships with Israel. And this is literally, this is his words literally. And he called the world not to boycott Israel. He wanted the world to boycott the settlements. However, if we discuss the boycott of settlements, we will find that there are no real efforts that are being exerted in this regard. Some information may be new to some of you. There is not only work in the settlements. This is something we can understand. There are investments in these settlements, investments in Israel. These sometimes reach to billions. This is a documented study that for its documentation and proof, we have exhibits and documents. There are investments in the settlements in Israel. Furthermore, there are Israeli products that receive a certificate of origin from Palestine, and they are exported to Palestine, to the Arab countries and the world as Palestinian products. Those who want to boycott, and this is a proposal that we proposed, there should be a draft law that would ban, prohibit and prevent all cooperation and investment with Israel, and any person who works, invests or have relations with settlements would be punished by legal persecution and prison. This would help us hold accountable the countries that they say that they are against Israel. When we do that, we will hold them accountable for their responsibilities, and we would have the opportunity to achieve big achievements in this regard. I cannot agree on separation between Israel and occupation. It is not practically possible to have this separation. But the problem is already here. If you want to boycott for the settlements, there is a way to do that, particularly after the Hague's verdict on that. And the heritage that we have from international law, it enables us to do a lot in this regard. It is a very important topic that we have to have into consideration. My second point is that our problem is not related to the leadership of the PLO. Unfortunately, different movements are playing around with the margin that's provided to us from Israel. It is a conflict over power in West Bank under the occupation, and conflict over power through the besieged areas in Gaza Strip, despite all the differences. In fact, the main conflict that depletes a lot of Palestinian power is the conflict for the two powers. This is something that we have to look into through the microscope. There would be no solution until this is dealt with. This will not be dealt with through the elections. It will be the de facto elections. It will, because there has been a significant change in the orientation of the Palestinian Authority and President Mahmoud Abbas. It started in 2010 and it was manifested in 2014 and after. They do not have even the project for the Palestinian state. It's not whether this state is viable or not. The president, his policies, his movements, tactics, and the balance of power all indicate that the president's strategy in that time, if we are able to call it strategy, if any, can be summarized in 2 points, which is existence or survival and waiting. Without thinking that we are able to establish a Palestinian state. This is a problem. He told many people, including Arabs and including people in the region, that 50 years ago a Palestinian state will not be established, and there is no other project. Then why you are clinging to power? Leave room for other groups to be able to formulate a national project. And just like Hanin said, do we need projects for each part and segment of the Palestinian people, or do we need a collective Palestinian, a collective inclusive Palestinian project? This is something that needs to be discussed, studied, and agreed on. This is without ignoring the specifications and the circumstances and context of each gathering. Are we one people? Are we facing same risks? It doesn't mean that we have to work together because we are one people. The Zionist project is still going on. It is witnessing a prosperity because it is utilizing the Arab regional and international circumstances to achieve what they were not able to achieve across the past decades. They are trying to annex lands legally. The displacement cause is not urgent, but it is part of the Israeli agenda, so that we are not faced one day with the 1848. Ask Turkey how many people have bought homes, lands, and are doing businesses. They said because they are not feeling stable in Israel. Enough evidence is the crime rate amongst our people who were there before 1948. It is 4 times the other parts of the Palestinian land. It is drugs, crime, violence, all of it is part of the plan. Displacement doesn't mean putting us and transporting us in trucks and buses. They create a situation for us where life would seem to be impossible, and they would make social and economic situation for us difficult. Previously, going to work abroad didn't mean that they are leaving their homeland. People used to work in Saudi, in the Gulf, in Americas, and other places around the world. But now numbers of people are leaving as eternal immigration. Look at what happened to the Lebanese, to the Palestinians in Lebanon. More than their half is outside their Lebanon as immigrants. Look at Palestinians in Turkey. Let's not discuss it in a different way. We will see that there is a direct and indirect immigration process that is going on. Look at the Israeli plans, the studies, the discussions, and the research papers. Immigration is the alternative homeland, is the Palestinian state in Sinai, is the the creation of the United Palestinian Emirates is these ideas indicate opinions and planning that maybe the official adopted policy in Israel. We should not ignore that. We should think strategically forward. Sometimes we think only for tomorrow. We have to think about ourselves for today, tomorrow, after that, after 10 years and after 30 years, how we will be prepared for what will happen, and how we have to take into consideration all possibilities, potentials, and that we create our strategy based on having more than one choice and moving from one choice into another. It's not only an academic issue, it's not a scientific issue, it is a political issue par excellence. We need to be prepared for all possibilities, and change cannot be done through waiting for the change in the frameworks and the leadership, but through the interventions of the ideas and the new ideas, new powers, new groups that learned from the lessons of the Palestinians, from the past experiences. Based on that, we do not want to repeat our past experiences. We cannot ignore reality. There is a reality that may lead to some of the things we are mentioning, and ignoring this is a political mistake. Surrendering to that is a bigger mistake. We have to deal with reality in order to change that reality, having into consideration that what we achieve in one stage is not the end of the road. Revolutionary Puritanism is not useful all the time. My objection to the Gantz recommendation is that it is provided for free. Nothing is done to counter that. Very little is being done to counter that. Some little promises, some partial promises that are not documented, and at the same time it led to internal harm for Palestinians more than benefit for Palestinians. And if it continues, it will repeat and replicate the Oslo Accords experience, as if the concessions we provided in Oslo were not enough. We had great concessions and we got little. Israel had some concessions because it needed that solution, but this has changed after the advancement in technology and after the opening of new markets without need for us. Therefore, there are political changes and economic changes that lead in Palestine. We have changes in the communities of 1948 and Palestinians outside. We have to study them, and we have to understand why people are only thinking of themselves, of their own interests. It's not the ones who are negotiating, but the ones who are struggling for that. In Gaza, they have been fighting alone. In Jerusalem, they are fighting alone. This is a result of a structure, an economic, political security structure that is separated from the Palestinian rights objectives, and that as for legitimacy, you are 2 minutes late. Your last sentence. There is a necessity to rebuild PLO as a representative body of all Palestinians by inventing standards and bases that represent Palestinians, not through factionalism for the groups and not through detailed elections with specific arrangements, whether it is inside Palestine or outside. But it should be part of the framework of the new national project. It should take into consideration all the peculiarities, led by one leadership that can lead the Palestinians and the Palestinian people to safety. Thank you. God bless you. And now our last speaker. السيد سيساتسو مع حركة المقاطعة وسحب الاستثمارات وفرض العقوبات BDS ودور المؤازرة وفي النضال لمكافحة الفصل العنصري.
Thank you, Chairperson of this session, and good afternoon, comrades. Comrades, ladies and gentlemen, let's start by thanking Comrade Dr. Rima Khalaf and the entire leadership and organizers of this conference for bringing this together. We are indeed honored, comrades, for the opportunity to share with you our own experiences and our views on a matter that has indeed in many ways captivated the entire world for many, many, many decades. But first and foremost, especially in light of the International Solidarity Day yesterday, we wish to give a special salutation to the Palestinian people who have and continue to bear the brunt of dispossession, occupation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, dislocation, and the dehumanization of apartheid. We want to use this opportunity as well, comrades, in light of that, to reaffirm for all the world to know that our humanity is common, or our common humanity is inseparable, and our freedom and dignity indivisible. And in that context, we hold fast to the instruction of Comrade, the late President, our founding father, when he said that we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. So we ourselves are products of a bitter history of centuries of wars of resistance from 1652, ending with the 1908 rebellion and the modern-day struggle, which of course started with the formation of the ANC, Africa's oldest liberation movement, in 1912, to the democratic transition in 1994. So being beneficiaries of international solidarity from well-known and not so well-known, but mostly unknown men and women who spared no blood and treasure in pursuit of our freedom with no expectation of gain, a movement which became known as the anti-apartheid movement. We are acutely aware of our historical obligation and indeed our obligation to the oppressed peoples of the world, because history and posterity has indeed thrust upon us the primary responsibility to be amongst those who are the forefront of struggles and should be the embodiment of those universal values and principles and indeed timeless truths so poignantly and eloquently set out by Jose Marti when he said that every true human must feel on his own cheek the blow dealt against the cheek of another. So we believe, comrades, that this conference must indeed be a practical expression and an inspiration of the humanist principles set out by Che Guevara when he said that every time that an imperialist power subjugates a territory, it is a blow against the freedom, dignity, and humanity of every citizen of the world. And so the lessons drawn, comrades, from similar experiences of former and currently colonized peoples of the world are undeniable and universal in their application. They are that colonialism, racial and ethnic supremacy are old mutually reinforcing evils which coexist in a diabolical system of oppression and subjugation of one people by another. Its nefarious aims are inherently achieved by all means necessary at a great cost to humanity. Comrades, we believe that South Africa's 342 years of struggle to end European occupation, then which became settler colonialism, racial domination and apartheid, is highly instructive. It's instructive in both understanding the dimensions and repercussions of Israeli apartheid, and I hope will be helpful in our discussions about the evolution of strategies and tactics as necessary tools of struggle and as the only means to combat it. And so at this point, I wish to invite you to come with me and take a cursory look of the situation in terms of where are we now. Certainly, of course, after decades of bloodshed and other countless crimes, Israel would ignore UN resolutions and will never fulfill conditions of its membership of the United Nations. And in the meantime, the Nakba continues. It continues unabated, while our governments find it impossible to hold Israel accountable, or at the very least, enforce their own conditions of granting Israel membership of the United Nations. That is at a very, very bare minimum. And so a cursory look at the international situation will highlight, and I hope will draw our attention to some of the challenges and hopefully engender an appreciation of the implications for civil society. And so let's just take a quick tour of what the international situation is without going into too much discussions. On the UN seems to be paralyzed, or at least unwilling to bring this matter to its logical conclusion. The UN is paralyzed, the Security Council paralyzed, and indeed vulnerable to the cynical machinations of members of the P5, and has become a useful instrument to serve the geopolitical and strategic interests of permanent members of the Security Council. And so despite its banditry, Israel enjoys adequate protection, especially from the US, France, and the UK, and to operate outside the bounds of international law. Now, this is not news. On the EU is battling with its own internal contradictions and increasingly beholden to US diktats on its foreign policy. The EU and its member states seem to be in a stasis, despite, of course, the periodic and carefully worded statements of feigned condemnation, but meaningless nonetheless. And so, notwithstanding the groundbreaking actions emanating from cities in Europe, especially from tiny places like Ireland, and the work of civil society is exemplary and an inspiration to all of us. In the US has abandoned, of course, its most precious commodity, its sovereign independence, and has ceded it to a powerful pro-Israel lobby and financial interests whose sole concern are to ensure continued uncritical support for Israeli policies and, of course, to shield it from international sanction. Now, this is starkly manifested in the seemingly blank check that Trump gave Israel to pursue its expansionist ambitions and to destroy any real possibility for the realization of Palestinian aspirations. Nevertheless, the growing voices of discontent amongst young Americans and the significant work activists are doing on the ground and their rise in alternative media are doing a lot in trying to influence US public perception. In the Middle East and North Africa, a number of countries in this region, in the MENA region, are in the grip of internal conflicts, regional instability, and proxy wars in pursuit of Western and narrow geopolitical and strategic interests. These have tragically manifested in the brutal theaters of war and deaths of hundreds of thousands in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and so on. Paradoxically, Israel is the greatest beneficiary of these conflicts, and its adversaries are now doing business with it and collaborating with it on a wide range of activities. The tragic consequence, of course, is that the Palestinian question has been relegated to the back burner. The actions of these states are in stark contrast, though, with the popular sentiment in the region. It is the latter fact and the consistent vibrancy of civil society which remains a viable possibility for influencing the situation. And so, elsewhere around the world, Israel is once more entrenching its role as a force of deep stabilization in Latin America, as we have seen lately in Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia, now in Bolivia and elsewhere. In Africa, under the Iron Dome cover of the United States, and often at their initiative, Israel is undertaking a diplomatic offensive in Africa, which is characterized by offers of military aid, weapons sales, agriculture, and technology aid to countries who are in deep distress in exchange for renewal of diplomatic relations. Their attempts to hold an Africa-Israel conference earlier this year thankfully failed. But this was thanks to the opposition of countries like South Africa and others. But these are all part of Israel's attempts to wow Africa to gain observer status in the African Union. In my own country, in South Africa, seeing no prospect of influencing the governing party's policies, the ANC, Israel and the Zionist lobby have resorted to supporting and funding opposition parties and fielding Zionist candidates in elections. Their strategy is also to re-engineer and weaken the socio-political fabric of South African society through cultivating a right-wing Zionist Christian US John Hagee type of Christian movement in African townships as an opposition to the former liberation movement. They do this through funding and pilgrim tours to Israel and so on, and also through innocuous symbolic developmental projects in a few African townships. Notwithstanding, after arduous work of advocacy for more than a year with our partners and allies in the trade union movement and the Communist Party and so on, we managed to get the 54th National Conference of the ANC, the governing party, to unanimously adopt a policy resolution to downgrade South Africa's embassy in Israel to a liaison office. As its first step of implementation, the South African ambassador to Israel was subsequently withdrawn and has not returned to Tel Aviv officially to resume his duties. The Zionist lobby, on the other hand, has since resorted to threats of sanctions, of US sanctions, and the courts to challenge South Africa's implementation of this decision and any other government policy which purports to hold Israel accountable. And so the question is, where to from here? Advocacy as the last line of defense and BDS as a tool of resistance. So inspired by the success of the anti-apartheid movement, Palestinians called on the international community and people of conscience all over the world to take similar actions against the Israeli regime. The primary objective, of course, is to get Israel to recognize Palestinian rights and to bring it in compliance with international law. So taking a leaf from the South African liberation struggle, which in our case, as Comrade Barghouti spoke about 6 pillars yesterday in his talk, we had adopted 4 pillars then. I'm not going to elucidate on them. Suffice it to just name them. It was mass mobilization, the internal underground, armed struggle, and international solidarity. I'll focus on international solidarity. Since the banning of our movement in the 1950s, already the ANC undertook an extensive campaign around the world advocating for a single issue: international support for an end to apartheid. So that was a very clear, simple message that everybody could understand. But this involved a lot of hard work, which meant building a broad anti-apartheid front with diverse civil society organizations across issues and focus areas, and mobilizing South African exiles in foreign countries to become a linchpin of this effort. They were encouraged to become part of civil society organizations of their host countries and utilized those platforms for advocacy work. The campaign was, of course, initiated on 3 fronts. It contained of individuals and groups leading anti-apartheid campaigns within their own countries. It had governments acting individually or in concert, and it had a full-scale focus on multilateral institutions like your Commonwealth, your United Nations, and so on. But owing to this multi-layered agitation by civil society, as a result of civil society action, the General Assembly passed a resolution that, of course, as we know, deemed apartheid to be a violation of South Africa's obligations. This was subsequently followed by voluntary boycotts by member states. They broke off diplomatic relations, they started seizing trade, and so on. This was, of course, followed again by the establishment of a special committee of the UN against apartheid, which was to coordinate many of the efforts. It later culminated in the adoption of the UN Convention, what we call as the UN Apartheid Convention, but it's really the UN Convention on the Prohibition and Suppression of the Crime of Apartheid. And so sports and cultural isolation, perhaps among the most innovative were the efforts of civil society to isolate South Africa socially and culturally, and this was later successfully incorporated into the policies of sympathetic governments. This, of course, led to academic boycotts. It paved the way for cultural sanctions. It paved the way for South Africa's suspension from FIFA. It ensured the exclusion of South Africa from the Tokyo Olympics. It led to the decision to expel South Africa from the Olympic Games. And of course, as many of you would know, the high point was when civil society mobilized thousands in protests who invaded the pitches. At that rugby game. On economic sanctions, campaigners then sought to defund apartheid by imposing an oil embargo and launched a series of divestment campaigns, initiatives which, with sufficient pressure by civil society, led to the following. 1, the oil embargo in 1973. 2, forced the European parliamentarians and governments to impose limited trade and financial sanctions. In the US, under sufficient pressure by campaigners, civil society, under the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus, the US Congress forced Reagan's hand when it passed the 1986 Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, banning new US investments in South Africa, new bank loans, and so on. Of course, Reagan used his veto, but this veto was overridden by a determined Congress that had an organized civil society breathing down their necks. And so I can go through the list of all the things we have achieved. But the fundamental takeaway from this issue, comrades, is to say that these were results of advocacy work. The successes gained by the anti-apartheid movement were on the basis of the work they did in pressurizing their parliamentarians and governments. We know that governments will never act unless they are pushed by civil society. And so we should not fret, comrades, we shouldn't panic. We expect this kind of action from the United Nations and other international institutions. And so towards conclusion, I want to highlight just a few challenges and opportunities that I think is critical as we emerge from the conference. These are issues that we need to focus on, Comrade Khalaf, and find a way forward. Amongst them are, of course, the Hasbara and the anti-Semitism smear, the attempts to crack down on dissenting voices around the world. Amongst the actions that we see is what is now commonly known as deplatforming of Palestinian human rights activists. We see the negative role of the global media, various states and EU countries that are enacting draconian anti-BDS legislation, the criminalization of Palestinian human rights. Those are some of the challenges. There are a few opportunities, though. And the opportunities are, one, for us to begin building a broad constellation of forces around the globe in many other countries. I think there's probably 1 or 2 of us here from the African continent when there's 55 members, 55 countries on my continent. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. It is, amongst others, to build those alliances and synergies across social justice groups, is to lend support to grassroots organizations and expanding our solidarity efforts beyond our traditional basis. It's about changing the narrative about Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. It's about emphasizing the nature of the state of Israel as an apartheid state. It's about ensuring that we build a critical mass that will be able to ensure that we push these organizations, whether it's governments, our parliamentarians, and international institutions, in the direction that we want them to do. If we are able to do that, as in conclusion, if we are able to do that, we will then be able to declare that this conference was successful. If we are able to emerge here with practical things beyond this conference being a mere talk shop and we go back to our countries, we would have succeeded in our mission. And these days we're spending here would have been worth it. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I concluded from this conference that there is no difference between apartheid of Israel and apartheid of South Africa. Thank you very much for your participating in this conference. Honestly, I benefited from this conference individually, but now there is a press conference, so I have to finish it. شكرا لكم ولمتابعتكم. إنه فهمت إن لا يوجد فصل العنصر الإسرائيلية وفصل عنصر جنوب أفريقيا.
So there is no difference between the apartheid system in the apartheid system in Israel. I hope that it will end one day. That is in Palestine. Thank you very much for your participation. Now we have a press conference, so I have to close this session. Thank you very much.
Dinleyen Türk izleyicilere de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Umuyorum ve diliyorum ki güzel bir konferans oldu. Ben faydalandığımı ifade etmek istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.